to a Hope 1032 podcast.
As followers of Jesus, in whom all things were made, we acknowledge the Darug people as the traditional custodians of the country of where this podcast is recorded. We acknowledge their continuing connection to the land and waters, and thank them for protecting this land and its ecosystems since time immemorial. We pay our respects to elders past, present, and future, and we extend that respect to all First Nations peoples listening today. Warning. The book discussed in this episode contains mentions of suicide and self-harm. Listener discretion is advised. And if you or anyone you know needs help, you can call Lifeline in Australia on 13 11 14 or visit lifeline.org.au. And that information is in the show notes.
Hope Book Club with Georgia Free. Because life's just better with a book.
Hi, I'm Georgia, and welcome to episode 76 of the Hope Book Club podcast, where we chat about books from a hope-filled Christian lens. I'd love for you to join our Facebook group. We have almost 500 members. You can search for Hope Book Club on Facebook. There's some great chats that happen there. And today, I am absolutely honoured to be speaking to who I believe is one of the most important voices in Australian literature today, Shankari Chandran. Shankari is the author of books such as Song of the Sun God, The Barrier, and Chai Time at Cinnamon Gardens, which recently won the 2023 Miles Franklin Award. Shankari was raised in Canberra before spending a decade in London working as a social justice lawyer, before eventually returning home to Australia, where she now lives with her husband and 4 children. Her brand new novel, Safe Haven, has just been released, which follows the story of Feena, a Catholic nun from Sri Lanka fleeing from war who arrives in Australia seeking asylum. It's a mystery, it's a love story, it's a story of belonging, and it's a harrowing examination of Australia's immigration policies. Shankari, welcome to Hope Book Club. It is such an honour to have you here.
Georgia, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here with you.
Firstly, Shankari, congratulations on another fantastic book out in the world. How are you feeling? Are you feeling relieved?
Relieved. I'm feeling all the things. I'm relieved. I'm excited. And at the same time, that mild to increasing anxiety about putting yourself out into the world, and in particular with this book on a topic that can at times be very contentious within the Australian psyche. And I am very fortunate because when I handed Chai Time at Cinnamon Gardens over to my publisher, Robert Watkins at Ultimo Press, I then began pretty much immediately writing my next story, because writers love to write, and I'm happiest when writing. If I'm not writing, I become quite unsettled. It's almost like I'm unmoored if I don't have a novel to keep me stable and located. And so I just began writing what became Safe Haven immediately. And that process took about 2 years. And during that time, but I was partway through a draft when Chai Time at Cinnamon Gardens first came out. And then it had a year on shelves and then another 6 months before it won the Miles Franklin, just because of the timing of things. And by the time that announcement was made, I had actually completed a pretty solid sort of 10th draft of Safe Haven. So it existed in the world before any of this spotlight fell on me as an author or on Chai Time or on any of my work.
Right. And do you think that helped in the long run?
Immensely. Therefore, this book was written without any awareness of any readership, really, or a sense of a large readership with expectations or the weight of an award. I just wrote it because I wanted to understand what drives our detention policies, and I wanted to elevate community responses to that political narrative.
I'd love for you to tell us more about what Safe Haven is about. I gave it a very brief introduction, but I feel like I can't encompass it in just a few sentences. For those who never picked up the book before, what is it about?
Well, I thought your summary was excellent, actually. I was trying to write it down because I am also struggling to describe it in a pithy elevator style manner. And I call it a love story and a murder mystery set on a detention center. And it is about displacement and seeking refuge, and about the lengths that people will go to to find safety, love, and community. And that's the novel at a high level. And then, of course, we could dive deeper into the two characters, Fina, who you described already, the nun who's rescued from a sinking ship, making her way to Australia to seek asylum, escaping war and the atrocities there, whose life intersects with that of Lucky Dharman, who is a federal investigator who is sent to the detention center to investigate the suspicious death of a border security guard. And as that investigation progresses, we see that the secrets that Lucky might have to reveal will both place Fina, a woman she's grown to admire and respect, in danger and could shock the community town that Fina has come from or has established a life in, and could indeed shock the nation. So watch this space. Read more.
So good. It's so good. And it's gripping right from the start, I will admit that. Where did the inspiration for this book come from, Shankari?
The initial emotional inspiration came from the Biloela family. Or in fact, going back one more step to that, when I moved to Australia, or moved back to Australia in 2009, the rhetoric of boat people and queue jumpers and this sort of threat, this imminent threat of terrorists flooding our borders through the oceans, and our vast coastline was a very powerful rhetoric that existed at that time. And I found that concerning because it felt like xenophobia being politely wrapped in the language of border security. And it felt like deliberately alarmist politics, and the treatment of asylum seekers felt incomprehensibly cruel, the way that we were choosing to treat them. And at the time, that was something that I saw within the larger landscape of life in Australia, which was where we as immigrants, and I use that with inverted commas because I think actually we're all immigrants except for First Nations people, but we that had been deemed immigrants had a very precarious and vulnerable position in Australian society. And this troubled me because I had moved back to my home, Australia, with my 4 children and had wanted to give them this home, this tremendous country that I had been raised in and loved. And then I thought, God, what have I done? I don't know Australia, or I had seen all these things in my childhood, but it has escalated, and I've brought my children back to this place to create a community and a family and a home. Can we do that? And so the first response to that was to write myself back into the Australian cultural landscape through Song of the Sun God. And then, I think we fast forward some almost 10 years of writing and failing to be able to write, and then Chai Time at Cinnamon Gardens and so on. And I felt ready and more mature and more skilled as a writer to keep exploring these things that were making me angry about the country, but that I wanted to explore in a respectful and loving manner. And one of those things was really sparked by the Biloela family, because although their suffering was terrible, but it was also representative of a broader and deeper issue about how we treated and how we viewed detainees or asylum seekers, how we chose to detain asylum seekers. And so I was inspired by the injustices that they were facing and their community's response to that, and their initiative and leadership in this, what became a national campaign to bring them home to Billow. And a few years before that, I think it was, I had read this beautiful memoir, which I would really urge your listeners to read. It's called The Power of Good People. And it is about an asylum seeker called Parapahir and his experiences of leaving Sri Lanka, being rescued from the ocean by a Norwegian tanker. So you'll see where some of my characters and my big moments have come from. And then he's taken to Christmas Island when Christmas Island was still open. And he begins writing letters or receiving letters from a grandmother in country Victoria. And she's part of an association, a network of associations of rural Australians who connect with asylum seekers and try to help them. And that relationship helped him eventually navigate the immigration system, leave Christmas Island, move to her community and bring his family over and establish a successful life. And so I was really inspired by her kindness and his resilience, and wanted to bring all that together in a novel that is in some ways less about cruelty and much more about the power of community.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think you've balanced that so well. How did you actually research for this book? Because I think there's a difference between inspiration and then the research that's required, especially with the detail in which you know about detention centre policies and how the centres operate and things like that. How did you actually research?
So the first thing that I decided, and this I think is not every writer's way or every researcher's way, but I have spent a lot of time writing submissions for law reform campaigns based on the lived experiences of people who are most deeply affected by the failures of those laws. And I think elevating those voices is really important, and drawing on those voices is very important. What I didn't want to do, though, was actually communicate with the Biloela family during the writing of this novel, because for most of that time, they were detained with their future completely uncertain, and the threat of deportation hanging over their heads, with their children and them suffering tremendous health and mental health issues. So it was not at all appropriate for me, I felt, to reach out to them. And because we're all Sri Lankan Tamil, there's only 2 degrees of separation between any of us in our community. And I could have done that, but really did not feel that was the right thing to do. I know Ali Cork from The Power of Good People, and through her have learned so much more about Parapahir and their story, and liaised with Auntie Ali. So I call her Auntie Ali because she's an elderly lady, and in fact Parapahir calls her mum because she is his mother to him. She has become his Australian mother. And so I liaised with her, read her memoir, but also had conversations with her. There are a huge number of human rights reports on the internet. And the other thing I should say that I decided not to do is to actually go to a detention centre onshore, and I didn't even attempt to go to one offshore, because it felt voyeuristic, and again, it felt wrong to observe people in incarceration. And that was very deliberate for me. And I remember discussing this with other researchers and other writers, and with grant-making bodies, as to how I would approach my research. And that was a parameter that I was very clear about, because there is so much lived experience set out in human rights reports by incredible advocacy organisations. So there are refugee organisations, there's the Australian Human Rights Commission, there's the Public Interest Advocacy Centre, there's the Human Rights Law Centre, and the Caldor International Centre for Refugees. And all of them produce extraordinary policy documents, or documents that summarise the law, that give you access to the lived experience of people who've been through that system and either are in detention still or have come out of detention. And then they also provide opinions and insight into the situation. So often legal opinions. So I think my children are sick of me driving them to soccer games whilst listening to law reports on podcasts. But they are wiser and more motivated to drive justice than they might have been previously, or just don't want to drive with me anymore. So so that was where, and there are these incredible memoirs, powerful collections or anthologies of witness statements almost, but personal witness statements of what detention, and I keep wanting to say incarceration, what detention is like in these detention centres, both offshore and onshore. And I chose the location for the novel. I constructed it deliberately to be offshore, because whilst both experiences are heinous, the offshore experience, it is that much more removed physically and emotionally from us. And I wanted to take the reader into that experience. And of course, logistically, I wanted to create the isolation of the island that my protagonists need to navigate.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that very thoughtful response. I'd also love quickly for you to speak into a little bit about the history and the conflict of Sri Lanka. Obviously, you yourself and your family are Sri Lankan Tamil. A lot of the characters in this book have that history as well. But for those who aren't aware of that kind of context and history. Can you perhaps share a little bit about?
I will try very hard to summarize. As you can tell already, Sri Lankans are very long-winded. Sri Lanka's civil war was between two ethnic groups, the majority ethnic group, the Sinhalese people, who are predominantly Buddhist, and the minority ethnic group, Tamils, who are predominantly Hindu, although there are Christians on both sides, and there is a small Muslim population within Sri Lanka as well, who have themselves faced enormous bigotry from everyone. The conflict began in 1983 and ended only in 2009 with what we as Tamils call a genocide. So in the last few months of the war in Sri Lanka in 2009, hundreds of thousands of Tamil refugees or displaced people were herded into the northeast of the country, and then they were fired upon by the Sri Lankan army, who was trying to reach and annihilate the Tamil Tigers. The Tamil Tigers, who were the militant force trying to fight for a separate Tamil nation for the Tamil people, then also used their own people as a shield to defend themselves. And so it was a bloody and morally compromised war, perhaps from the outset, but certainly by the end of it. And what happened at the very end is the focal point of FINA's experiences. So when that slaughter took place, when the survivors were placed in refugee camps, when they were supervised or managed by members of the Sri Lankan army and mercenaries or militia that had been employed by the Sri Lankan government to be participants in that war. The genesis of the war happened decades before. So before 1983, when the war broke out, there were decades of civil unrest, of persecution of Tamil people by Sinhalese people, of changing of laws and constitutions that effectively rendered Tamil people second-class citizens in their own country, which then created this drive for them to move and centralize in their ancestral homelands of the north and the east and to claim a homeland. And so then in 1983, what broke out was effectively a battle for land or a battle for a homeland between these two sides.
And what a lot of people don't understand is that, people escaping on these boats, trying to get to Australia was their only hope for survival in escaping this very real persecution and violence.
Yes, and a persecution that had continued after the war had ended. And that's a really critical point, because Australia's narrative around the Sri Lankan war is that it's over and that the rule of law has been reestablished. This democratic government is doing fine, which, just a couple of years ago, we could see the democratic government was not doing fine, and that human rights were no longer being abused. And so even after the war was ended, the Tamil people's rights and human rights were being abused, and they were still in danger, particularly where they had connection to the war. And were still feeling that they had to flee the country on boats and go to other places, including Australia.
There's no denying that this is obviously a heavy book. There's no way of escaping it when you examine these issues. And I will just put for a warning for listeners, in the first 50 pages, there are mentions of suicide and self-harm. It is quite a confronting situation. But I will say that there is such a sense of hope and humanity, even woven in the beginning of that book, which was just so... I don't know, it just made me very emotional, actually. How conscious was that decision to, even in the worst experiences of these people, to retain that sense of hope and humanity?
So the reason that I was about to sneeze is because when you were talking, Georgia, it makes me feel emotional. And so my nose was about to, and then I was about to cry. And because I wanted to say thank you for feeling that sense of hope within the novel. And that was really important to me. And I think in my next novel, it's not that I want to write a false sense of hope. It's that I want to keep remembering what it is about people and what it is about community and culture that gives us strength and that gives us resilience and the ability to be good to each other and the ability to remember what it is that we owe to each other in a good way, not in a burdensome manner, but in the way that it is a privilege to owe goodness to someone and to owe a sense of responsibility to someone. And the ways in which we as a species might come to regard strangers as our community and as our friends. And that we not just look to our own or look to our own family or our own ethnic community, but look more broadly, to have a sense of citizenship and community much more widely than we have been always taught, to have or to look to. So with Safe Haven, it was really honest. It was really important to me to be honest about human nature. And that is both in the ugliness of it, but also in the extraordinary beauty and greatness of it. And I think it's often too easy and too often done that we focus on what's wrong and we allow ourselves to spiral into the pain and the injustice of that. And there is a time and place for that. Because if you don't remember it, then you won't fight to change it. But then the question becomes, how do you fight to change it? What are the tools at your disposal? Where does the strength come from? What is it that we're heading towards? And that all comes from a place of generosity and kindness and strength and resilience and goodness. And so in this novel, I wanted to remember the truth of that and to elevate it.
What a beautiful response. Shankari, you've said that you don't presume this book is going to change any laws around immigration detention in Australia, but I think there's got to be something said for broaching these issues in a novel setting, because I feel like with more and more people just turning off the news on just not in that setting, they're probably not going to be in a place to listen. But when you pick up a book and you're transported into this place, I think you have a different openness of heart. Was that a conscious decision on your part?
Absolutely, because I feel like books are a really safe place for the writer to take the reader into discomfort, and while providing that emotional safety, to challenge them and give them insights into different and very hard and very dark places. And at the same time, as you've said with the book, to help lift them out of it and to move them forward, as this book I hope does. And so I think literature, it's a magical place, and storytelling is a powerful advocacy tool and activism tool with which to reach people. And I often, when I read human rights reports, I think the information is out there. It's just out there quietly, or advocacy organizations are pushing it out there really well, but it's in human nature to look away. And literature, and indeed television and film, can do something to support the work of those advocates. I don't see us as in any way being better or a replacement to that. Justice can only be meted out by the institutions of justice, lawmakers, lawyers, systems, laws. But writers of fiction can try to help.
Shankari, there are also many faith elements in this book that I really love as well. Obviously, the main character, Fina, is a nun. Did you draw on any personal faith or spirituality when writing the book? And how important was it to have these elements kind of sprinkled throughout?
I think the writing of faith within my work it's very organic, because I have a deep faith in Hinduism, which in itself is a faith in a divinity that exists all around us. And it's a quite a different religion, and we don't have time for me to explore that with you. And you'll be grateful for that. But it is actually a very relaxed and easygoing faith that exists constantly throughout your life. It's not something that you go to or necessarily do. It can be. There are many cultural practices around it, but you don't have to do it that way, as it were, because it's a philosophy in the way that you live and think and feel and love. And at the same time, I have learnt so much about Catholicism over the years, because some 25 years ago, could be more, my brother married a beautiful Australian, South Asian Catholic girl, who is now my sibling, obviously. And we participate in some of her family's rituals and times of fellowship. And so we learn about Catholicism through that extended family. And Catholicism is important in Sri Lanka, and I wanted to bring both of those faiths into this novel. And I wanted to make the novel accessible to people who don't share my faith, but will generally understand or be aware of the Christian or a Judeo-Christian and Catholic faith. And all as a Hindu, we can worship in any place of worship. So you'll find Hindus praying in mosques and churches. I used to go to church regularly with my grandmother, who was a devout Hindu. And we joke that it's because we'd like to cover all bases, but it's actually because we feel that all religions are just different paths to the same outcome and offer a guidance on how to live good lives. And so I wanted to bring both of those faiths into the novel. And as you'll know, I will try to explain without giving you story spoilers. There are times when you see one, but we're expecting the other. And so I love the interplay of both the ways that faiths can be different, but also very much the same.
Yeah, fantastic. Shankari, I'd love to talk about you for a little bit as well. You spent a decade living in London, working as a lawyer in the social justice field. I think that experience definitely plays out in your writing. Can I ask why the switch? I feel like you are, I think, the fourth or fifth author I've spoken to this year who was previously a lawyer. I feel like this is a very common path.
This is a very common path. I like to joke that lawyers are deeply unhappy and dissatisfied people who've got a book within them and are desperate to manifest that book, and that we all became lawyers when we should have become writers in the first place, possibly because we lacked the courage to pursue the deeply insecure life of an artist. And instead we made much more conventional and safer choices, and thereby lived unhappily ever after until we rescued ourselves by writing novels. So that's kind of why and how. I had always loved reading as a child and throughout my life. I've loved storytelling. I am uplifted by film and television, although I admit that sometimes my late night Netflix addiction is probably killing my brain. And I find it inspirational and mesmerizing. And I'd always wanted to write, but never really understood what that meant. And then pursued a very conventional career, but although in some ways unconventional, in that I went into social justice law because I love the way that the law can protect individuals and the way that it can transform societies. And I had always been passionate about justice. And so it was a wonderful privilege to go into that area of law. And of course, in that area of law, you see the worst of humanity and the best of humanity. And that really, I think, infuses and is inflected in my work, in my fiction. And I took a break from my legal career at a certain point when we moved back to Australia and had our fourth child, and thought, I know what I'll do. This is a great opportunity to write that book that's always, been inside me. And of course, as soon as you start, you realize just how much harder it is. And then fast forward a couple of years, when you finally produce something of any kind of literary worth at all, you then realize that you thought writing was the hard part, getting it published is the hard part. And then and then my career just progressed, as you will know.
Shankari, you're also the Deputy Chair of Writing New South Wales, and I know that there's a lot of authors or budding authors that listen to this podcast. Do you have any advice for those maybe writing a book which are, struggling to find that encouragement at the moment?
Yeah, I would give people the same advice that my fifth grade teacher, Mrs. Vandermark, gave me. And Mrs. Vandermark will be forever venerated in my literature. She's Easter egged in Chai Time at Cinnamon Gardens as the librarian, and a library is named after her at the end of the novel. Mrs. Vandermark told me to just keep writing. And I know that sounds simplistic, but actually it's not. It's simple words, but very important words. And Neil Gaiman, for example, says that if you want to be a writer, you have to show up at your computer and just write. You've got to put the words down. It's as simple as that and as hard as that. That's what he says. And that's very telling, isn't it? It's as simple as that and as hard as that. Mm-hmm. And so I would say just keep writing. Don't be disheartened. Don't listen to the naysayers. Connect to the story and keep going.
I love that. Shankari, how do you unwind being engaged, not only obviously with these stories as an author, but being deeply engaged with complex issues such as immigration and detention centers? It takes a toll. How do you kind of, fill your cup back up? You have mentioned the late night Netflix addiction.
Yes, there's definitely that. Last night, if you're interested to know, I rewatched The Grey Man, a fun but mindless action movie for like the third time. To refill my cup. And it probably didn't refill my cup. It probably just denied me valuable sleep and much needed sleep. I read. I go to boxing 3 times a week
Fun.
and beat a bag. And I took my daughter the other day, and at the end of it, I was like, "Can you see why they call me killer?" And she burst out laughing because I'm so physically weak. I'm the weakest, most uncoordinated person in the class, and I love it. I just love it. It really helps me to externalize, because there's a lot of rage in some of the things that I think about, and there's a lot of brutality in some of the things that I have to research and write about. And I like to get that out of my body, and I need to get that out of my body. And so boxing helps me. The most important thing for me is spending time with family and friends. And I need to get better at being mindful about it. So I can sometimes be with family and friends, but mentally not be there. And I am this year, one of my sort of self improvement objectives, if I may call it that, is to really value and be present during the time that I have with the people I love.
What do you find yourself thinking about when you're with them, but your mind isn't with them?
Yeah, I can be thinking about the story I'm writing. I can be thinking, why don't I have a story to write? Which is how I'm feeling at the moment, because Safe Haven is on its way. I'm about to start that campaign. But what I really want to do is sit down and write a new novel. But I have not had the headspace to think that through. And so part of me is thinking, when I'm with other people, I'm literally thinking, I need a new story to write. Because, as I said, it gives me that anchor, right? It connects me to my best self, and when I'm not writing, I don't feel quite right within myself. So I can be thinking about that. I can also be running through my to-do lists, of which I have many, because, as you know, for all of us, we have life and work and children and admin and laundry, and so the lists are. I'm doom scrolling through the lists in my head.
That's the worst kind of doom scrolling.
It is the worst kind of doom scrolling, isn't it? And then I think the worst thing is the scourge of my phone. I will be with my children and then have a quick check of my phone. And before you know it, I've gone from the important text message from my mother saying we're arriving at 3 p.m. to 12 minutes on Instagram that has served no one and has taken me away from my children and has modeled terrible behavior to them. And once again, has taken me away from my children. Yeah, so that's what I do when I'm doing the thing that's not quite right.
Yeah, I think that is a very, very common thing. We're all trying to fight the phone. We really are. Shankari, I'd love for you to share some of the books that you've been loving recently, if you have any recommendations to share.
Oh my goodness, do I have recommendations?
Yes.
So in the next few months, this is one for people to put on their TBR pile, or their list, not the actual pile by the side of the bed. Because it hasn't come out yet, but I was able to read an advanced copy of a book called The Myers, Mires, by Tina Macaretti. And she is a Maori writer. It is about the power of women, and it's about radicalization and society's decline into radicalization and its consequences. But most importantly, the power of women, the power of culture, and our ancestors and community. And I loved it. I could not. I read it I think I smashed it in 2 sittings, and I just could not stop thinking about it. So The Myers would be my hot tip. A book that's out at the moment is Dirt Poor Islanders by Winnie Dunn. This is, I think, the first novel we've seen in Australia by an Australian Tongan writer.
Wow.
She does not pull any punches. It is a really honest, beautiful, at times brutal, but ultimately uplifting novel. So I would highly recommend Dirt Poor Islanders. And for book club, my third pick, I will stop there, is The Reformatory by Tananarive Due. The Reformatory. And this is set in a boys' reform institution in 1950s Florida, Jim Crow, Deep South. And it explores systemic racism and abuse, but uses the genre of African American horror. So it uses the genre of horror.
Wow.
To explore the horror of life for African Americans then, and as we know, does still exist today. And it sounds bleak, and at times it really is confronting and bleak. And at the same time, it is uplifting. And it's really powerful storytelling. So if you like writing and think that storytelling has power to reveal and change people, then this is a good one for you.
All right, to finish off, Shankari, when people pick up this book, what do you hope they learn?
I hope that they learn that although there is darkness and we fall into it very easily, we are easily led and we are easily manipulated into being our worst selves. I hope that readers look at this book and realize that we also have the capacity for greatness and goodness, and we are able to come together and be our best selves.
Safe Haven is out now, wherever you get your books. Shankari Chandran, thank you so much for being on the podcast. It has been such an honour to chat to you.
Thank you, Georgia. The pleasure and honour has been mine.
And you can follow Shankari on Instagram at Shankari Chandran Author, or you can visit her website at shankarichandran.com, and that information is in the show notes. Make sure you join us over on Facebook at Hope Book Club for more updates, book recommendations, and great discussions. And we'd also love this podcast to reach more people. So the way to do that is to rate, review, subscribe, share this episode with a friend who you think might like Safe Haven. Until then, stay reading. Here is a quote for your week. This is actually from Shankari's previous book, Chai Time at Cinnamon Gardens. The stories we tell each other and the stories we tell ourselves. The stories we reveal and those we hide. The stories we tell our children. These are the temples we build. They must not be erased. Catch you next time.